The Hallowed Villager. This haunted mob isn't just here for the spooky season. No, he's here until he gets revenge on those that wronged him. You see, not too long ago, the villagers were at war with the Illagers, and the battle between the two was fierce and bloody. But the Illagers were far more aggressive in their attacks than the villagers ever were, as the Illagers would go into innocent villages and burn them down, leaving no survivors. And that's exactly what happened to this village in the plains not too long ago. It was just an ordinary day. Farmers were farming, fishermen were fishing, and life was good, when suddenly they were attacked and the village was burnt down and everyone was killed. Well, almost everyone, as one villager survived, as during the onslaught of the Illagers' attack, he fell in a cave. He was severely injured, but because he'd fallen into that cave, none of the Illagers saw him, and so he survived. But he couldn't move, as the injuries were just far too painful, and so he just had to stand there for a number of days, hoping that another villager would come to save him before he starved to death. But very luckily, his wish was granted, as during the sunset of day 4, a group of 3 villagers arrived at his village. They had been sent by the villager leaders to assess damage here and recover any lost valuables. The injured villager hears them and tries to call out to them, but they don't hear him. He was too quiet. And so once this group of 3 had collected all their valuables, they start to leave. But then the injured villager, knowing that if they don't come and save him, he will die, calls out as loud as he could, and this time they do hear him. And so they all ran over to the cave entrance, and the injured villager was thanking them profusely for saving him, and he tells them what happened to him. But these villagers just don't care. They all just stand at the top of the cave, staring down at him, as they weren't sent to collect a damaged villager. Plus, even if they did save him, it would just be hindering their ability to fight the Illagers, as someone would have to look after him, and that would mean that someone wouldn't be fighting the Illagers. And so to them, it just wasn't worth saving him, and so they just covered up his cave and abandoned him, as if he was already dead. The feeling of hope that this injured villager had just moments ago melted into a feeling of anger. How could they have done this to him? Villagers are meant to work together, not against each other. He was so angry that he started to have a burst of energy, and he felt as if he could walk again. And so with that burst of energy and anger, he stood up and mined out of the cave and started to run after them. He wanted revenge. No villager should ever do that to another villager. But the pain of his injuries was too much. He couldn't go any further, and he blacked out. Several hours later, he finally wakes up. He was still badly hurting, but the pain wasn't stopping him from moving anymore, and so he starts walking away from the burnt remains of the village, as he knew that the Illagers would probably return to this village to set up another outpost or recover any lost ammunition from their raid, and so he knew he had to move. And so for several days, he keeps on walking, constantly on the search for a village, so that he could warn all the other villagers of the selfish actions of those villagers that abandoned him. But he couldn't find any villagers. But he did eventually find something, as he ended up finding a swamp. But as he enters, he suddenly hears a voice deep within. Who was that, thought the villager. He didn't know if he should follow it or not, but very quickly he decided to just follow it, as he had nothing to lose at this point. And so he started to walk deeper into the swamp, until a few hours later, the voice spoke again. He continued following the voice for another few hours when he comes across a witch's hut. He didn't know if he should or not, but he'd made it this far, so why not? And so he stumbled his way into the witch's hut, and as he entered the hut, he saw that it was all empty, except for a mysterious cauldron in the center. The villager leant down to touch it, when he started to have visions of terrible things that the villagers had done all throughout history. It was just horrifying. He was disgusted with what he saw. The illusion of the villager being good, righteous creatures all just shattered right in front of this injured villager. It became clear to him that most villagers were greedy, selfish and vile creatures, and they didn't deserve to exist anymore. And he was so angry with this realization of the villagers being terrible creatures that he became obsessed with the desire for everything to change. In fact, he wanted his own people to now suffer for what they had done in the past. Also, he felt that he was no longer a villager, but instead another victim of one of their crimes. The mysterious voice said to him. He nodded his head in agreement, and instantly lightning came crashing down onto him. All of his injuries and pain that he was feeling just disappeared as waves of power came surging through him. His eyes turned red and his suit was burned. The area all around him became blood red too and was now clouded in a blanket of mist.
This is your domain now. All the creatures that live here are yours to command. Control this wisely.
He didn't know what to do at first, but quickly he thought it would be a good idea to see all of his new subjects. And so his first action in his new territory was to call out for all evil creatures to emerge from the shadows and meet him in the center. His plan was to grow an army with all these creatures that he had and attack the villagers. And so he stood there and started to explain his plans to them.
We are going to unite, and we are going to fight back as a strong army against the most evil villages, and we shall rule the world.
The witches seemed intrigued by this, and so they all stood forward in agreement, and so did the skeletons, as well as the slimes. They all wanted this, but the creepers, zombies and spiders all thought that this plan wouldn't work. They had been fighting the villagers for thousands of years, and they thought that they would never be able to rule the world. And so the evil villager, seeing that these creatures weren't going to be helping them, banished them from his domain, as he didn't want any being that wasn't going to help him in his victory to have the benefit of his rule. And so he waited for a few minutes for all of those creatures to leave his domain, and then he started to talk to the witches, and he spoke about dark magic, and he asked them if anyone knew about it. The witches responded saying that a lot of them knew some parts of dark magic, but it was all very disorganized and everyone knew different things. And so his second order was for the witches to all discuss their knowledge and share everything that they knew, as he wanted them very soon to be able to summon skeletons from the ground, as that way he could create an army that was so large that it would be able to crush the villagers with ease. But at the moment, none of them knew how to do that, so he was hoping that they could learn quite quickly. But whilst the witches were sharing their knowledge of dark magic and discussing how they could meet their master's demand, the evil villager focused his attention on the skeletons and slimes, giving them more specific orders. First, he split the skeletons into two groups. One group would stay here in his domain, and they would construct a mansion where their evil leader could live, and where the witches could conduct their dark magic experiments. Meanwhile, the other half of the skeletons would go out into nearby villages just outside their domain and kidnap as many villagers as they could and bring them back to the mansion where he wanted the witches to experiment on them. And those slimes, well, they'll be scattered all across his domain, and their goal was to ward off any villager that ever tried to enter this domain and attack. It sounded like a good plan. So fast forward a few months, and the construction of the mansion had been completed. It was a grand building and it towered over the dark domain. It was just what he had wanted. Also, those witches had been experimenting in the basement of that mansion, and together they had been able to develop their dark magic skill set far beyond what it was just a few months ago. As today, they now knew how to convert villagers into loyal skeletal subjects. Now, the evil overlord wanted more from the witches, as he wanted them to be able to raise an infinite army of skeletons from the ground. But for today, this was good enough for him. And so he ordered the skeletons to bring in all the villagers that they had captured and take them to the witches, where they could be converted into skeletons, the perfect loyal warrior. And so once all of the villagers had been converted, this evil overlord had quite a significant skeleton army. And so with that, he left his domain with his army, and they began attacking as many villagers as they could. And every time, they would take the villagers hostage and then convert them into loyal soldiers. And for every village they took, their army grew, which made it easier to take the next village. And so that cycle repeated over and over and over again as the evil villager grew his army rapidly and his domain spread even further. At last he was achieving his goal of ending the villager race, surely but slowly. But soon, because of his destruction to the villagers, legends spread about him, and they called him the traitorous villager, and everyone thought that they were just random attacks on the villagers, and every villager feared him, as they were already losing the war against the illagers, and he was just making things even worse. And when the traitorous villager heard that they were all scared of him, he thought he could torment them even further and cause even more distress, which could allow for even easier raids. And so to do that, every night before an attack, he would command one of his skeletal minions to run out into a village and leave behind a pile of jack-o'-lanterns, so that way in the morning all the villagers would wake up and they would hopefully all be discussing why a lot of jack-o'-lanterns had suddenly appeared in their village. But little would they know, that was all a distraction, as while they were staring at these glowing pumpkins, the traitor would be starting his attack. And surprisingly, this strategy was extremely effective, as no villagers ever escaped him, and so the news of their strategy would never spread. And so very soon with this strategy, he was able to kidnap even more villagers and grow his army rapidly, as the witches were now converting more villagers than ever, and his army was in the hundreds of thousands, and the villagers were losing. But he was running into a problem with all of this success, and that was that he was very quickly running out of jack-o'-lanterns to haunt the villagers with. But soon he found a solution for that, as now whenever he raided a village, he made sure to keep behind the farmer villagers, and he made sure that they weren't converted, so that he could instead force them to farm pumpkins for the rest of their lives. It sounds evil, but it was the way he was able to create infinite jack-o'-lanterns. However, one day, by accident, one farmer was able to escape, and he left the domain running away. And when he arrived at the closest village he could find, he tells his story to the villagers. And he explains to them how the traitorous villager was using the villagers as tools to help with his attacks. When news spread of this, villagers all across the world were outraged. It was one thing to kill their people, but it was another thing to enslave them and use them as a tool for war. And so with that outrage spreading amongst the villagers, they started planning an attack on the traitorous village and his domain, as they wanted to take their people back. And so over the next few days, thousands of villagers joined together and they all entered its domain. The anger that these villagers felt meant that they were charged up and ready to kill anyone or anything that was in their way. No slimes could stop them, no skeletons could stop them. The witches tried to stop them, and they did slow them down, but these villagers were far too motivated to turn back and not attack, and so they charged onwards, killing those witches, and they kept on going until they reached the mansion, and they were going to free these villagers from this evil, traitorous overlord. Nothing was going to stop them, and so they started running onto the pumpkin farms, telling the villagers to be free and to join this battle. And for once, they were finally winning. The traitor's army was losing against them. This was going to be their moment of glory. But no. Before they could actually get into the mansion, the evil villager leapt up into the air and spoke.
Thank you for redirecting the villagers to Hallowed Mansion.
Tens of thousands of witches and skeletons all emerged from the shadows at once. This was all a trap. Almost every villager was taken in to be converted or was killed on the spot, and the farmers were forced back into farming more pumpkins. That was the lowest point for the villagers, as a large part of their strongest warriors had just been killed. But somehow, a few lucky villagers were able to escape, and they ran as fast as they could away from the domain, and they spread news of the villagers and their humiliating defeat. They spoke about the events, recalling the traitor, calling their mansion the Hallowed Mansion. And seeing as they hadn't given the traitorous villager a proper name at this point, they decided to name him the Hallowed Villager. And that name became the most feared thing for every villager still alive. But now, back to those villagers that had escaped. That was also intended by the Hallowed Villager, as he had actually wanted them to spread news, as he wanted them to tell all the villagers about their humiliating defeat. It was all a plan for him to lower morale for the villagers, and he had succeeded, as they all knew that they couldn't fight back, and defeat was coming. And it was coming even quicker than they had expected, as a group of witches in the traitor's domain had just made 2 very impressive discoveries with their dark magic. First, they had discovered how to hide the mansion in such a way that no one could enter it without being a part of the Hallowed Villagers' army, which meant that there could be no more attacks on the mansion, and thus they couldn't possibly be defeated by the villagers. But not just that, these witches had also discovered a way of cloning the skeletons, just as the Hallowed Villager had commanded them to learn months ago. And so now, with this dark magic infused into some technology, they were able to create a cloning machine. And so now their army was growing far into the millions. This is what the Hallowed Villager had wanted all along. This was going to allow them to crush the villagers permanently. The Hallowed Villager watched on from his mansion as his army was marching away, and how tens of thousands of villagers were being destroyed.
This is payback. Goodbye, villagers.
But just as he was about to drag the villager race into extinction, one villager reminded all other villagers of a way that they could fight back. It was extremely risky for them, and it could result in them losing this war against the Hallowed Villager even quicker. But it was their final hope. They had nothing to lose anymore. And so to find out what they used to fight back, and whether or not it succeeds, you'll need to watch this video.